Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Keir Starmer has been very vocal about his mission to reset Britain's relationship with Europe and to put the UK back on the global stage. 2 weeks into the job, he got a chance to make some headway when he hosted more than 40 of the continent's leaders at Winston Churchill's ancestral home. Just before that, he had travelled to Washington for the NATO summit. But what's his best strategy for fostering global relationships? In this episode, we speak with someone who is arguably the best place to answer that question.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The city.
The city.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Welcome to In the City, a podcast from Bloomberg about the stories important to the City of London. I'm Allegra Stratton, and my co-host Francine Lacqua and I spoke with Baroness Ashton of Up Holland, also known as Cathy Ashton, currently a Labour member of the House of Lords. Previously, Cathy Ashton served as the first ever High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security from 2009 to 2014. It's a role that even she admits took some time to cultivate and understand.
I recall going to Moscow to have a first proper sit-down meeting with then Foreign Minister Lavrov. And I could see that they were all quizzically looking at what on earth this was. And sometimes it's useful to be able to explain that you also understand that we're at the beginning of a process, not the end. And so I told a joke that the then Slovenian Prime Minister had told me, which was very simply that the American president is told by his Secretary of State that there is good news, that the Kissinger question, if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call, had been answered. And the answer was me. And so with great gusto, the American president says, well, why don't we call Cathy's number, see what happens? And they call my number and they get my voicemail. And my voicemail says, welcome to Europe. For the French position, press 1. For the Italian position, press 2, and so on. And as I recall, Lavrov laughed. My message, I think, got through that I was under no illusion that we were starting a process, not finishing it.
Cathy was one of the world's most powerful women at the time, immersed in some of the most complicated problems, many quite similar to the problems the UK faces today. So we spoke to her about what she sees as Labour's priorities regarding trade deals, their relationship with the US, and their strategy for rehabilitating a European relationship soured by Brexit.
You're one of the great diplomatic minds that the UK has. What will diplomacy and foreign affairs look like under Keir Starmer?
It's great to be on the podcast. And I think the first thing to say is that there is an understanding of the importance of ensuring that Britain plays its part in world affairs. And that translates into a number of things. First of all, the importance of the relationship with Europe, not to look backwards, not to go backwards, but to go forwards, to develop a stronger foreign policy, security, defence relationship with the like-minded countries of the European Union. It means looking across to the transatlantic relationship, regardless of who's in the White House, and ensuring that the depth and strength of that continues. Britain was always known as the bridge between the European Union and the United States. Well, that bridge isn't quite there now, but there's still a lot to be done in that relationship too. And then I think some of the big foreign policy questions that we're facing, the war in Ukraine, the crisis in the Middle East, the strength of our relationship with countries we've known a long time and countries we're trying to develop new relationships with. And of course, the challenge of China. So very clear, big issues to be dealt with, but I think a determination that Britain will be more present than it's been in recent years.
If you look at European countries, they're all grappling with the same issue of an increase in migration. I'm really wondering how the Labour government manage to get from the French and the Germans and others agreement on handling migrants, just purely from the perspective which is they also have their domestic electorates that are very volatile, like the UK electorate. What's the way through? Is it possible?
I think you have to start further back in a way, which is why people are moving. And one of the things that is always a challenge in foreign policy is the short cycle of governments and the fact that we are dealing with always more than one crisis at any given moment. So it tends to be a bit like the game whack-a-mole, where you kind of whack the crisis back down and then move on to the next one.
Arrive.
and hope that it won't pop up again. But so many of the issues that we face in the world have taken decades, if not centuries, to erupt. So why we think 2 years is going to solve it, I don't know. So the first thing to say is that there's a collaboration to be done that is more than just Europe, which is about saying, why is it that these people are coming? What's happening? How do we inject some ways of sort of solving the problem, or at least alleviating the problem that we're not doing already, that maybe could help? And also looking on the horizon, scanning for places that are likely to erupt. And that may seem sort of easy to say and very sort of long term, but actually you do need to think in 10, 20, 30 years' time, what will be the challenges that we face? And I've mentioned climate change as a good example. If people are living without the infrastructure and the social blanket, if you like, that will support them, then what happens when they can't grow the crops? What happens when the village is flooded for the fourth time? They have to move somewhere, and they may choose to move internally, or they may choose to move further afield. And that's going to be one of the things that we have to deal with, regardless of how effective we are in solving some of the problems that we have on climate change. So number one, start much further back in the process. And then number two, we're in it together. We're all trying to tackle this in the best way, recognising that people come for different reasons, recognising that you have to make choices and they're hard and difficult, and then trying to be more collaborative. And I think that at least is a good place to start. How they're able to do this, what the agreements will look like, is not for me to say. But I think it's important to at least begin that process and to really think about what could make a difference. And I think actually smashing the gangs that create the misery that we see would be a really, really effective tool.
See, it's interesting, Lacqua, that you bring up immigration, because for me, if you look at some of the challenges, right, in 2024, it's probably like US and Trump who wants to put tariffs, and then you don't really know how to deal with China. But I guess there's a disconnect between these bigger foreign policy issues and what citizens vote for, right? I mean, foreign policy, people don't vote for governments on foreign policy. Is that a mistake?
Well, they don't. But again, because it's actually domestic, they're voting on domestic issues, which actually have a foreign policy element to them, sometimes bigger than others. So on issues of migration, immigration, there are bigger domestic and bigger foreign policy issues buried within that than there would be when people think about, the cost of things or whether their small business is going to be effective and so on. Those too have a foreign policy implication. If you're no longer able to trade in Europe the way you did because of the way things have worked out, that has a direct impact on you and your family and your community and your customers and so on, and your workforce in particular. If we can sort of solve some of those problems, which is foreign policy, then it has a direct impact on the domestic. So although people rightly vote on the issues that concern them, that's not to say that foreign policy doesn't play its part in helping them get what they need.
So you've dealt with let's call them tricky characters. You've negotiated with Iran, you've negotiated with Russia, and Lavrov. What was your secret tool in trying to get them to the table and actually sign something?
Well, if you take the Iran talks, I had two jobs. One was to help hold the 6 countries together, because this was China, Russia, United States, France and the UK, the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, because they'd been an original negotiator with Iran. It's the only negotiation in history where the P5 worked together and stuck together and voted together. And it's a great loss, amongst many other things, that possibility no longer exists, at least for now. And getting them to have a common position when they needed and wanted different things from the negotiation, they'd have settled for less or needed more, was one of the jobs that we had to ensure happened. Because what you have to have in a negotiation as complicated and as technically complex as the Iran negotiations was absolute clarity that we are all on this position and we're sticking to it. with the manoeuvrability you also need in a negotiation. Because what would have been disastrous would have been if either Iran had felt able to pick off a couple of countries, or equally that they would have been completely confused if the messages they were getting were different. It would be impossible for them to be able to develop their own position. So that was number one. And the second job then was to take that and to negotiate with the Iranians. The US did a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because that's absolutely true. But it was a 6-country negotiation with the EU chairing and leading it. And we shouldn't underestimate the role of any country, because there were moments in that 4.5 years of my negotiation when each country did something that actually held the talks together. And that's something we shouldn't forget. But getting that negotiation to work was about those two things coming together.
Did you realise things about yourself through that process? Sorry to go all psychoanalytical, but it's so hard to keep all those 6 countries going. Is it a very personal job, or is it something, you go onto autopilot and it's actually, you've got a briefing and you stick to it and so on? What's the balance between the personal and the statecraft of the Foreign Office?
Well, of course, I've never been in the Foreign Office, and I was creating a brand new Foreign Service, and I'd never been a diplomat. But I'd been a negotiator, as it turned out, and you sort of recognise the skill set. As leader of the House of Lords or as a minister in the Lords, I never had more than 22% of the vote guaranteed. So everything I did was a negotiation. I'd chaired a health authority, which meant merging hospitals. That was a negotiation. You sort of understand in yourself that there are skills that you've got, that you recognise in yourself, that you use in that context. So I suppose the thing I discovered about me was that this was something I knew how to do. It was very challenging to carry the weight sometimes of the Iran negotiations. I didn't carry it alone, but I carried it. You felt it. You'd be in a hotel for sometimes weeks on end, trying to work through very technical issues, trying to get an agreement that would hold, and knowing the consequences of not doing it could be extreme. And you felt that a lot. But there was a part of me that also thought, but I know how to have these conversations and how to manoeuvre my way, how to listen for the nuance. I often say to young diplomats, the first thing you do is listen to what they're saying between the words. Mm-hmm. Because when people read out their speech or they give you their first, line of attack, they're often saying things that you've just got to understand. And the more you can get underneath that, the more you can work out who you're dealing with and how to establish the kind of relationship that might get you there. That really matters.
But it's hard when you have nothing in common, I guess, in terms of values with someone on the other side.
It's, of course, hard, but almost inevitably in a negotiation, you're not negotiating with your mates. You're negotiating with people who you're trying to change their behaviour and who may have very little in common with you. But of course, we're all human beings. And one of the things that is, I think is so important is that you should always find a way to do what I call the warm-up. So in all the negotiations I do, I always spend time with people before we sat in the formal chairs, finding out what was happening. So in the Iran talks, I had dinner with the chief negotiator the night before the talks, every single time we met. With the Serbia and Kosovo dialogue, I met the 2 prime ministers separately for a cup of coffee beforehand. So you can pick up a lot of the nuance. And just more generally, if you sit in this big room with loads of press photography going on in this big negotiation, it's much easier to begin the conversation, as I always could, with "thank you for dinner." It's really important to always keep a sense of yourself and also a sense of humour. There are some extraordinary moments in diplomacy and in negotiation where people do laugh. And often when you explain that, people sort of say, how can you possibly share a joke, whatever? But funny things happen. Weird things happen. And you have to be able to do that. It's a human thing. And above everything, whatever you're doing in diplomacy, you're dealing with human beings who look at the world in a completely different way to you, look at you in a completely different way to the way you see yourself. but they are people. And somewhere along the way, if you can find ways to connect, not to cross over to their side, but to connect, you've probably got a better chance of getting to a solution.
We're recording this before Keir Starmer actually hosts European leaders at Blenheim Palace. I mean, this was basically a forum that was set up by Rishi Sunak. So is that awkward for the Prime Minister? What will he try and achieve from Europe, which is, I have to say, quite distracted with political matters?
Well, it's a forum that Rishi Sunak was chairing, but it's, of course, an original idea by President Macron. And the Foreign Office is very good at working out how to manage transitions from one group of people to another, not least because actually in the previous few years we'd had a number of changes both in the Foreign Office and actually in Prime Minister, so they're kind of used to a bit of that. But the fundamentals are already set anyway, because it's not just about what the British want out of that agenda, it is also a more collaborative discussion. And I think what probably happens in the differences where things come up on the agenda and how they're dealt with, of course, shows that things have changed. So we shall see how that translates into what happens afterwards. But there'll be a lot of curiosity, I'm sure, as well. You know, who is the new Prime Minister? What's he like? And so on. And a lot of countries wanting to see him visit them, wanting to see how far they can have, you know, real dialogue with him, bilaterals and so on. So it's going to be quite a busy time, I think.
Kathy, how much will the EU say to the UK in return for collaboration on security and defence that AUKUS and some of that Pacific tilt needs to go, or may not be feasible for it to go, but how much do they see the UK's attempt to build relations around the world and in the Pacific as at odds with more collaboration?
It was never a problem in the past. I chaired the defence ministers' meetings for 5 years. And within that, there was a desire to sort of try and collaborate effectively. It wasn't about creating something European in the sense that people sort of try and put this as a negative. It was about how do we best use the resources we've got, bearing in mind we effectively share the same concerns and have the same issues. So within that, Britain already had lots of relationships. Other countries the same. I don't think it will really affect it. What they'll want to see is that there is a genuine desire to collaborate better than we've seen in recent years, and also to ensure that that fits well with NATO. The EU, through for example, the European Defence Agency, did some great work, certainly that I remember, on improvised explosive devices, on mid-air refuelling, on helicopter training, all of which benefited EU countries, but also, of course, benefited NATO as well. So getting that collaboration so that everyone benefits will be really important. I think they'll be more interested in that than trying to stop Britain doing things.
Kathy, I mean, there was quite a lot of fury over Trump's, vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, claiming that the UK is an Islamist country with nuclear weapons. Like, how should the Prime Minister deal with comments like that? Well,
as I understand it, David Lammy's already established some connections with the potential vice president. And I take the view, I've heard so much rhetoric from so many leaders over so many years that is about what I call the campaign rhetoric. You know, people say things because they're watching how the news covers issues. And as you'll know, in America, you can get a story that you recognise as a Brit, but it has a particular spin or a particular angle, such that if you didn't know what was really going on in Britain, you might take a particular view. And what I don't know is, of course, why he thinks that, where he's got this from. You know, what are the news outlets saying? What are the things he's reading, and so on. The most important thing is that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and others continue to work and build the relationships with both camps, both potential presidents, in order that the relationship that Britain has with the US, which is much, much deeper and much more sort of strong than any individual president or prime minister, but really try and work at that and not get sidetracked too much by what people say in the rhetoric, because, as I say, over the years I've heard some extraordinary things being said by leaders all over the place, which you understand in their own context. They're not talking to you, they're actually talking to their own domestic audience in some particular way. It doesn't make it easier, but it makes it at least comprehensible from that point of view.
But Cathy, what is undoubted is JD Vance and others. We interviewed Elbridge Colby, who potentially will be a potential Trump the second national security advisor, and the pivot away from Ukraine towards the Pacific or to China. How difficult is that going to be for the UK and others who want to support Ukraine?
I think it's really important to understand that the war in Ukraine is a war on the European mainland. In other words, this is something that we have to see from our perspective. We don't necessarily always share the same perspective that they do across the Atlantic. For them, because of their Pacific reach, they have different priorities. Doesn't mean these are not priorities for us, but maybe they're a little bit lower down. But Ukraine is really, really important. It's really important because of the consequences of what might happen in the future if Ukraine is not able to protect its sovereignty, not able to continue as a fully functioning state. Now, having said that, we know how important the US is to the capability and the capacity of Ukraine to pursue its objectives and to operate in this war. So it will be important to try and make sure that support happens. But as you know well, it's not just about the president, it's also about Congress. And, you know, I was up on the Hill only a few weeks ago. It's really important to understand it may not be as simple as whatever the president or some of his advisors say. It's going to be about where the American Congress, where the people are, and so on. So there's an opportunity, I think, that we can take, whoever's in the White House, in November and beyond into January when they take office, to be able to try and influence what happens.
Cathy, what made you go into diplomacy? Would you stand ready to serve if you were called to be UK ambassador to the US?
Well, those who've read the book know I found myself going into diplomacy per se, almost as a kind of, well, certainly going to Brussels. I think the media knew long before I did, because I watched it on the television going around on the ticker tape, thinking, that's interesting. I wonder if it's real. And by the end of the day, I was in Brussels. What I didn't know was it would be 6 years before I came home. So I believe in public service, let's put it that way. And if you believe in public service, if there's something you can usefully do, then of course you do it. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a fantastic team. They certainly don't need me. So let's see what happens.
Cathy Ashton, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, with Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Production support and sound design by Moses Andam. Brandon Francis Newman is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. Special thanks to Cathy Ashton. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.